Hi, everyone. This is Gene Rolke-Partain from Search Institute in Minneapolis. I'm delighted to be with you today to talk about getting real about developmental relationships. I'm senior scholar there at Search Institute and looking forward to spending the next few minutes with you. As we all know, social isolation and loneliness are significant factors in mental health challenges. Of course, there's a lot of other things too that make a difference, but really those social connections and building those relationships really are foundational for mental well-being. And so, but we often take those for granted, or we overlook them, or perhaps maybe relationships feel a little bit amorphous or intangible to really tackle in a systematic way. So what we want to do today is just dig into how we think about relationships in fresh, specific ways about how we can cultivate those relationships that young people need to be resilient and to thrive. So if you look on your browser, you'll find a link to download a handout that will be useful for you during this presentation. To get us thinking about this, we're going to start by introducing a metaphor to think about roots as a metaphor for relationships. So what do roots do for plants or trees that maybe help us think about relationships? If we're all in a room together, we might brainstorm about this. Since we're not, I'll just throw out some of the ideas that we might talk about. So one of the things we know about roots is they actually seek out what trees need or what plants need to grow and think about relationships. They help us actually through our relationships, they help us find and connect with what we need. Roots can bring in all kinds of nourishment into our lives through our relationships. They bring in what we need. They give us strength to withstand storms. When things are going bad, we turn to our relationships, to our friends, to our family members, to our teachers, to our mentors. They keep us grounded, like trees keep roots keep a tree grounded. Different kinds of roots have different functions for a plant. There's all kinds of things as you learn about roots, you begin to understand how central they are, how critical they are, and the many different roles that roots play in the life of a plant. And the same is true for relationships. So relationships don't just do one thing. And the same way, relationships um, aren't just doing one thing for us. There's many different parts of relationships. So that's really what we're going to dig into and begin to think about relationships as being multiple dimensional and having multiple parts to them. And in fact, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about principles for building relationships. And we'll have 8 of them here, and we're not going to talk about them right here. We're just going to go through these fairly quickly. And if you look on your handout on page 2, you'll find all these principles listed there with a little more detail, so you don't have to remember them all in detail. So the first principle is that relationships are multidimensional and dynamic. And if you think about any relationship you have, you know that's true. They change, they go in different directions. There's different things we pull onto in different ways. And so we have a framework of developmental relationships we talk about, which you'll find in detail on page 3 of your handout. We're just going to walk this through really quickly, but it's a way to begin thinking about relationships in a more intentional, holistic way. Sometimes we say that caring, which is the first dimension, we talk about caring adults, and that's really important, but it's not the whole thing. So our first dimension, though, is care. Show me that I matter to you. And that's really critical to think about someone who cares for us, someone who's there, someone who has our back. And we know that that matters. Young people will talk about whenever I need to talk to her, she's there for me. It's really comforting to talk to her. She always listens. These are quotes from young people that we've talked to. Sometimes I can talk to her and not feel judged. These are ways that young people need us to know someone's there, someone has our back, who's listening, who isn't judging, who's just there. And those expressions of care are foundational to building trust with students, with youth we work with, and with each other, frankly. So that expression of care is foundational, but it's only one of the elements of a strong developmental relationship or a relationship that helps young people grow and learn. The second element is around challenging growth, around pushing or encouraging a young person to keep getting better. And sometimes people get a little nervous about this one, but it's really important that we have someone in our lives who helps us understand the goals we have, not necessarily the goals that other people have. That's a whole different story because it's extrinsic. But when we have goals, things we want to learn and grow, who are the people who help us do that? Who are the people who encourage us to do that? Who really help us get access to those things? Who we know that people need those different kinds of challenge. So we don't want things to be so easy that they say, well, you don't really need to try. It's not a big deal. That's really gets too easy and we get bored. We don't want it to be so hard and so frustrating. They push us so hard that we get frustrated and quit. We need just that really right amount of support, what we call the growth zone, where they're encouraging, pushing us to do as well as we can, but not so hard that we get frustrated and quit. So this notion of challenging growth to push us to be our best, to help us learn from our failures, all of those kind of things are another part of any relationship, a developmental relationships that helps us grow. And a lot of young people will talk about coaches as the ones who help them grow, or a music teacher, or a teacher who pushes you to really do hard, to work hard. And when you don't do as well, they'll say, well, bad things happen. Pick yourself up and let's try again. The third element of a developmental relationship is providing support, helping me complete tasks and achieving goals. And so sometimes people think of care as being support, and it is a type of support in some models. We like to separate them out because this is really the tangible, practical ways, some people call it instrumental support, of getting things done that you need to get done. And young people need the best. In the ideal world, young people have different people who help them get different kinds of things done. Like they'll have a coach who help them learn some skills, a math teacher, different kind of skills, and all of those different ways that we help people find a job, learn how to do something, navigate through town, all of the different things. And having multiple people in your lives helps young people develop different skills, different interests, all of those kind of things. And so I think we all kind of get that it has to be there. And this is where the notion of scaffolding is really important, is how do you provide the scaffolding that for young people need at a particular point of time, and then over time, turn over that to them so that as they get better and better at things, you let go and then they can begin to solve the problems on their own. So that's all another part of a relationship, is that providing support. The next one is sharing power, treating with respect and giving a say. And when we do workshop with parents, sometimes parents get kind of worried about this because they sort of think, how do I share power? And I'm the dad or I'm the mom. This is my job. But even starting at young ages, you want young people, you want children even to begin having a sense of responsibility, taking responsibility, learning to do things. In adolescence, developing the sense of autonomy so they can become responsible as adults. I think about a program that I read, an article by Daniela the Kimono, who writes about a program in Scotland, actually, where the whole program is set up to create a relational culture where the norms are about not as adults as experts, but about young people thinking of themselves, learning to be experts, where they can explore things they're curious about on their own terms and try and fail and try again. And one of the young people said, he treats you just like anybody, like equally. He doesn't look down on you. You get the feeling he really wants to know about what you know, like I'm the expert for a small bit. So the idea is, how do we begin to respect young people, give them a voice, collaborate with them, let them lead when they're ready to lead, all of those kind of things, whether it's in a classroom, a youth program, other settings, just in our relationships with them, to know that they have something to offer and that they lead. And it's part of developing a sense of being a responsible, contributing part of their classroom, their school, their community, their youth program, whatever that is. That's part of a relationship, because that shows that you really value them and respect them. And the last one is expanding possibilities, connect me with people, places that broaden my world. And this idea is really about building social capital. It's about role modeling, sharing exploration, storytelling, asking questions, guiding, connecting with their interests and sparks. It's not about sending off things you care about. It's more about, what are you curious about? What are you interested in? What are your priorities? And then how can you begin to help them connect with someone, an idea or places or something that they're curious about, so that then they can begin seeing those things as opportunity for themselves. Um, and so those are things I think most adults will say they can remember some adult who's done that for them. Um, I remember my own experience. It was my own dad who actually got me interested in photography and took me to places where I could learn that, for example. And we did that together. So those kinds of experiences really matter in terms of how we learn and how we grow. So there's these 5 elements: express care, challenge growth, provide support, share power, and expand possibilities, all part of relationships. And they all work together, do them different times in different ways. And you don't divide them up between different teachers and one does one thing, one does another, but you build those all into your relationship. So one teacher said, this is my expectation, you have to do it, which is about challenging growth. But you want them to know, I was coming from a very caring, I want you to succeed place, which is expressing care. So you get the idea. So that's really the first principle. That's the one we'll spend the most time on. But I want you to understand this is sort of the foundation of relationships, are these multidimensional things that we do. And by having this framework, you can think about when you're in relationship with a kid, working with a kid, say, what do you think this kid needs right now? Where are they now? Do they really just need me to express care, provide support, or is they're in a place where they really need to be challenged? And that's really where the framework begins to have value. And where do you see it in the classroom or in the program you're working with? The next principle is that these relationships are the roots of success and resilience. I'm not getting in a lot of the research here because it takes a long time. You can find it on Search Institute's website. But the idea is that students who have stronger relationships, developmental relationships with their teachers, they have better academic motivation, and that leads to higher GPAs across different racial ethnic groups, both genders, those kind of things. They have higher social emotional competence. Their sense of well-being and mental health is improved, and they're more civically engaged. So these relationships really do help young people develop in multiple ways, just by having these relationships. And it's through those relationships that they're developing those other things. So they're not, the relationship is magical. It's just, that's how you develop and grow. The next one is these relationships are opportunities for all youth. All young people thrive through relationships. They need access to sustained developmental relationships. And yet we know that inequality, discrimination, and other things may exclude young people from some of the relationships if they don't have access to settings that don't have these opportunities, where they're not in relationship with other adults or peers that are positive relationships and those kind of things. And so when they don't have those relationships, it makes the journey through adolescence a steeper climb, the journey through childhood. So that's why figuring out how we make sure that young people have access to those kind of quality relationships is really important for all young people. Relationships are two-way mutual interactions. I actually I wonder if it's a relationship if it's just one way, but it's about how do we, in our relationships, how there's a give and take where we acknowledge each other, give each other choices, encourage self-initiative, and be responsive to each other. And this is partly about helping young people begin to be in relationship with adults and see it as a relationship and begin to engage with adults, not as equals, but in relationship. It doesn't have to be an equal relationship to be a relationship. So that, because we know that when we have some give and take, when we're responsive to each other, that improves the interactions. So that when a teacher or youth worker is engaging with a student or youth, that they acknowledge what they're saying. They may not always agree, but they can acknowledge, and we can talk things through, give choices, encourage that self-initiative, all of those kind of things. So that's a really important part of what I would say any relationship. It's true with a parent as well. We can get into all of that. So that's the fourth principle. Fifth principle, toxins undermine relationships. So we talked a little bit about this, about when all young people need these relationships. But we know, and this is just a statistic from one of our studies of youth in Minnesota, that when young people have adequate food and secure housing, they're more likely to have strong relationships. And it's not because they're they can't do it. It's because of the stresses that they face when they don't have the secure housing and they move around, for example, those kind of things, it can undermine their opportunities for those kind of relationships. So the idea that how do we begin to think about those missing opportunities for kids who may have other trauma or other kind of experience that are working against their formation of long, sustained, secure relationships. So another thing for us to work on. Um, the emphasis within relationships vary based on circumstances. So as I mentioned earlier, some young people may need different emphases on relationships than others. If a young person has been through a traumatic experience, it may not be the best time, for example, to talk about challenging growth. They may need a sense of more of empowerment or care to find their sense of their identity again or their sense of being safe again. And so Lauren Garrity at Communities and Schools San Antonio, who's been using the developmental relationships framework for a while, she talks about how the framework allows for differentiation to meet kids where they are and provide that kind of support that they need by looking across the framework at the different kind of things that you can offer to young people based on where they are in their life circumstances. The seventh principle is about healthy ecosystems are vital. Roots don't grow in thin air, at least most don't, except for a few weird plants. So these principles from actually from a World Soil Museum, which I didn't know there was one until I found this. It was kind of interesting. So soil roots require soil. And so beginning to think about what are the kind of soil or the environment that relationships need to thrive. Think about the foothold for roots and what does the culture give a safe place for relationships to get started. How does it hold, what kind of nutrients are in that soil of the environment that intentionally encourage relationships? How does it regulate the kind of nutrients or activities that help relationships grow without just sort of overwhelming the relationships and flooding the relationships by having so many activities? How does it buffer, if you will, from some of the outside influences that may disrupt those relationships or take them off track? And these are just examples to get thinking, but how do you create an environment within an organization that allows relationships to thrive? And so we could talk a long time about that, but to me, that's really the kind of things we need to be thinking about in our schools and organizations about what is the quality of the environment, the ecosystems that help relationships thrive. Then the last principle is how do you begin to think about relationships across ecosystems? And this is a study we did in one community that shows the number of strong relationships that kids have, the more they have, the better. When they have one strong relationship, it's good. It's better than not having any, as you can see from this line chart. But as you add more relationships, and these are relationships including family, peers, teacher, program leaders, and other adults, you see the more they have, the more likely to be academically motivated, and the more likely they are to have social emotional skills. And so the idea here is one relationship is great. It's useful, helpful, but the idea here is we've got to encourage kids and work across communities to say, how can we support our kids in all the places that they spend time to have those kind of relationships that help them thrive? So we have 8 principles. Some of them are quite intuitive. Some of them are perhaps more actionable than others, but they're all important for thinking about what do kids need in their relationships and how do they build those. So what I want you to do is, as we're wrapping up here, is to say on the worksheet, which is on the last page of the handout, is to look through the handout, think through the materials there, and say, what is one new action you can do to be more intentional and or inclusive about cultivating these developmental relationships? I'm guessing most everybody who watches this is doing some things already really well, but maybe there's something that you could do that would be different, to be more intentional about saying, I do this sometimes, but not consistently, or more inclusive, saying, maybe I'm doing this with kids who I already know, or the kids who are more like me, but maybe there's some ways I can do this with kids who are maybe not like me, or ones who are harder for me to connect with. And then think about how you can do that now in the coming up in this month with mental health, or in the coming months. and then thinking about how that can be part of really engaging every student through developmental relationships. And finally, I just want to leave you with a quote from my mentor, Peter Benson, who passed away more than a decade ago. He was a leader at Search Institute. And he said, relationships are the oxygen of human development, that nothing has more power or impact in the life of a child than positive relationships. And I think that's something I like to remember when I'm thinking about all the different things that are going on. And then in the end, the power, the importance of taking the time to stop and greet a child, listen to a child, and make the child know that I think they're important. So thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And thank you for all you do for children and youth in America.